All right, welcome into a bonus YouTube live for the Locked On Nets podcast, where, of course, I am Adam Armbrecht, and that to my right is not Doug Norrie. It's Andy Kamenetsky of the Locked On Lakers podcast, who we had a great conversation with both him and his brother the other day, talking about the state of the franchises. And as the world turns, things keep turning for the Brooklyn Nets, Andy. And I just, we were in our network meeting, and Jacque Vaughn officially gets retained as the full-time head coach, as well as being extended through the 2023-24 season. And I have my own perspective internally, but I always think it's worthwhile to hear from people around the NBA. How did this resonate with you relative to what you've been watching from afar with the Brooklyn Nets?
I mean, it just seemed like the Nets came to realize, and there have been reports that internally there was a lot of pressure to go in a different direction than Ime Udoka, not just the presumed front runner, the presumed it's about to get announced any day now.
Yeah.
The Nets have been in a PR crisis with everything going on with Kyrie Irving and just the general state of the organization for the last few years. And the signaling of Ime Udoka, the leaking of that information made it seem like the Nets thought that at the end of the day, winning fixes everything. And I think they may have come to realize this is one of the everything elements that isn't going to be fixed simply through winning. Like, there's stuff going on with this organization we got to clean up.
Yeah, that's the general impression. And I think that the second point then to that becomes, is this indicative of anything for the Nets organization? Because it seemed like if you're going to go the Ime Udoka route, you're willing to take the PR hit now because of what it could mean to keeping around Kyrie Irving, keeping around Kevin Durant, and trying to still win games this year. We haven't gone fully down this road yet because it is very curious. They've been 2-1 under Jacque Vaughn. They played another really close game against Dallas the other night. I'm of the opinion that I'm happy for Jacque Vaughn, who has been there, was the interim head coach, and then they hired Steve Nash and still kept him. So I'm happy for him at a coaching level, but I also wonder if the organization is now saying, and the rebuild is upon us. And that means Kyrie will be gone by whatever form or fashion. And then also that maybe Kevin Durant is going to be gone. I prefer to see if you can keep it together, because Kevin Durant does seem to be playing happier basketball these last few games. Winning helps that. If you are in the Nets' shoes, do you commit to Jacque Vaughn and then say, and we acknowledge it's time to rebuild this thing? Or do you still think there's a version of it where you can go forward?
Well, I mean, you take a look at it with seemingly less heat, and
Yeah.
adding Ime Udoka would only have added more heat and scrutiny to an already white hot scalding situation. But you also get a look at, perhaps depending on where things go with Kyrie, what does this look like without the chaos that he brings? Because he obviously is not the only problem with this organization, because there are roster construction problems right now with this team. Like, as much as you might believe in what they could do offensively with everybody healthy and on the same page, defensively, there are things that, frankly, Ime Udoka, for everything he showed he can do with the Celtics defensively, I don't know if anybody can fix the Nets defensive issues, because the personnel isn't there.
Yeah.
But you might get an idea of just, okay, what do things look like if it settles down a bit? What does Durant think things look like if it settles down a bit? Because in theory, everything is about keeping him happy.
Yeah.
And maybe if things look good, settle down without Kyrie, to whatever degree KD has still tethered himself to Kyrie, maybe that loosens up a bit in terms of his own commitment.
NBA perspective, if they want to keep Kevin Durant, but Ben Simmons hasn't been so good. I hit up the Locked On Lakers guys and I ask questions like, hey, you want this guy? But it will be interesting to see.
You ain't getting Westbrook right now.
I know. You couldn't even touch him. You couldn't pry him away from the Lakers at this point. But I do wonder about the partial rebuild over the course of this season, where you acknowledge Ben Simmons is not going to be a tradable asset because he hasn't shown anything yet, but a guy that's just getting back on the court for them in Seth Curry or a high-priced Joe Harris, they're all relative to what you're trying to achieve in a given season. So I also start to look at some of those. It'll be interesting. Yuta Watanabe went down with the injury the other night, and he was starting to have this little bit of an emerging role. So it's like you look at this roster now too, and I do think one of the, I don't say drawbacks, but just the byproduct is, well, this roster was constructed for something different than what maybe it's about to become. And then you start to even look at a guy that they just brought in and give up a first round pick for in Royce O'Neal, who's 29, 30 years old. And you go, are you nearly as valuable? And maybe we should have just brought back Bruce Brown, who's 5 years younger, and he could have been a more valuable piece going forward. That's like the unfortunate part of maybe making what feels like the smart decision, or at least, I don't know, maybe just the relieving decision of like, hey, let's stop doing this thing that isn't working for us, is also, though, you got to start looking at your parts and pieces and saying we don't have the same roster construction that we probably would have if this was the path we were going to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is something similar to what we talked about on today's Locked On Lakers podcast, because Bill Simmons had the Ringer had noted that he's hearing some chatter about Anthony Davis. Could he potentially get traded? He was not clear in this talk about whether that would be in season versus potentially off season, because the ramifications for that are obviously very different on a few levels. And Russell Westbrook has been linked to different teams throughout the offseason, even now. But the way he's playing, if you feel like, if you're another team, that he would buy into this type of role with you, all of a sudden his trade value might increase, or at the very least becomes different. He's no longer a guy that's seen as just, you acquire him just for these 2 picks and then you pay him to go away, or you waive him or whatever. But in talking about this, I raised the question that I think is ultimately central to all of this. Do you still think, Rob Pelinka, Jeannie Buss, the Ramby, everybody involved, do you still think that LeBron James is capable and worthy of throwing all of your assets behind as the guy that you can build around for a deep playoff run?
Yeah.
Because if you have any doubts about that at all, these other questions with AD and Russ, the supporting cast, the impression Darvin Ham's made of you, whatever, they all become secondary, because you are doing all of this in theory because it's worth it for LeBron. And I think in some ways you raise that question with Kevin Durant. Assuming he's even bought in, right, do you feel like you are in a place where you can maximize Kevin Durant? And then also, do you trust Kevin Durant's health moving forward, that he's going to be available and at that level that it all becomes worth it? So we keep coming back to these shows together, Adam. I think in a lot of ways the Lakers and Nets, they're not in the exact same place, and I still think the Nets are dealing with more toxicity than the Lakers, but they're still dealing with a lot of uncertainty and questions that have some commonality to them.
Yeah, and in the same way, it's interesting because the Nets don't have, beyond Kevin Durant in this moment, a multiple high-profile players that you could move, right? The Lakers could maybe move Anthony Davis if they wanted to. They could easily move LeBron James if they wanted to. And even,
well, they can't this season.
Yes, it's right. LeBron's restricted, right? So let me ask you, because and this is a little bit more expansive, and we're only going to hang out here for a few minutes. The big headline is just that Jacque Vaughn is going to be retained as the head coach for the Nets. And you can go back and remember that he was at the helm there at the back end of the Kenny Atkinson era, went into the playoffs, got swept, but played very hard in that series as the head coach, and has a terrible head coaching record, mostly predicated because when you get a head coaching chance and it's the Orlando Magic, almost in any decade, it's going to be bad for your resume.
You didn't have Dwight, you're kind of screwed.
Exactly. Once you gave away Shaq, it really all went out the window there. But would you? This is just again a completely in the moment thought. If you were the Lakers, I don't know what your perception of is where Anthony Davis is long term and his health. Would you look at like the Indiana Pacers, and everyone knows Miles Turner is like the apple of every team's eye? Do you look at the Pacers and go, well, if it maybe isn't going to work long term here, and we know LeBron's not going anywhere, maybe short term, is there a world where, quote unquote, dumping Anthony Davis and getting back a guy that you'd say Miles Turner's comes in and we extend him? They're not nearly the same level of player at the peak of their powers, but just thinking long term about how do we rebuild this team potentially with or beyond LeBron James?
No, if I'm trading Anthony Davis for less than value, unless I feel like LeBron with this roster construction, LeBron would ultimately served better with better role players around him, even if you have to give up a star to make that happen. Like you're trading AD essentially for higher end parts, like more depth that you would that would help LeBron better. Although really, if you're doing that, I think you should just try to trade Russ for Miles Turner and Buddy Hield and keep AD. But
And you'd be willing to give up the draft capital as opposed to keeping that. Yeah.
Well, either or. But the larger point I was going to make is if I'm moving Anthony Davis for anything that resembles a rebuild, it's not going to be for Miles Turner because he's too old. He's already too old for something like that. Like the Lakers need to.
He's the guy that's been dreamed on by every other team, every other fan base for so long that at a certain point you go, oh, you're not even the guy to dream on anymore. Who's the next younger guy to dream on?
Look, if you're talking about adding him to Anthony Davis,
yeah,
that's a possibility. But if you're thinking of trading AD as part of a rebuild, no, you want to go further down. You want even younger than Miles Turner. You want draft picks because the Lakers have barely any that they control. You then look to move Russell Westbrook for something similar to that. And then you see what LeBron wants to do moving forward once he is actually trade eligible. But, and this is something the Lakers can never really stomach. And it seems like the Nets have had a difficulty doing this after, what they had gone through when they brought in all those older past their prime stars. If you're going to do a rebuild, if you're going to build something, you got to build it from the ground up. You can't start halfway through the build. That rarely works.
And that's what I wonder about this, the Jacque Vaughn being as the head coach and getting the extension. It's in the micro, you say, team's having success. He has familiarity. Maybe there's an understanding that Kevin Durant likes Jacque Vaughn and does respect him as a coach, and you could move forward with that. The other side of it is if we are going to go into a rebuild and tear this thing down for parts, who better to almost reward again, you talk about rewards, there could be more favorable ones, but then Jacque Vaughn and say, hey, like you get every opportunity here because we are going to strip this thing for parts. It is going to be young players, but you're here and you get to play this thing out and maybe you get to showcase something. And I know that's nothing that Nets fans or likewise Lakers fans would ever want to hear in the version of where their teams are right now and the players that you have currently on the roster, but it is a reality. And I think it's one of the hardest things about, and there's good examples of this. You look around the league, OKC has been in a perpetual rebuild and they get all the young players and they have all the capital, but until they start winning significant amounts of games, that rebuild is not a good process. The Rockets are the same way, right? So there is that razor thin margin when you are a major market team of convincing your fan base, don't worry, we're going to correct this. But when you look around the landscape, lottery tickets are exactly that. They're opportunities, right? They are not guarantees. And maybe the upcoming draft class, as we know, who have some, the great term, unicorns in it, suddenly becomes attractive to these organizations in that way.
I mean, as we just learned, only one person won the Powerball.
Yeah. Good Lord. And I was promised, by the way, I bought one of those tickets and I specifically said, when I purchased it, I said, I'll buy it if I'm going to win. And they said yes. Yeah. So I don't know what kind of
recourse I can natural. Pick me a winner with the bat.
Yes.
You were promised something. You were Robert Redford promised something.
Yeah. And then they handed me a broken piece of tinder from the backyard that properly broke over my head. That being the case, this is a quick little hop on. Everyone, if you didn't know, Jacque Vaughn being retained as the head coach for the Brooklyn Nets going forward for the remainder of the season. We'll see how it plays itself out. And as Andy and I have said before in these crossovers, there are parallel tracks being ridden here by both franchises. Seemingly, there's been far less loose rail ties for the Lakers. Maybe they're heading kind of down a nice non-temperamental weather track, whereas Brooklyn's in a bit of a storm. But these things change.
Yeah, give us
time. Give me a week. Give me 2 weeks. We'll see where we stand. Andy Kamenetsky, Locked On Lakers. Appreciate you taking a few minutes with me. We'll let you get out the door. Enjoy the rest of your day. Good.
Yeah, you as well, man. Thanks.
All right. So that is, of course, Andy Kamenetsky giving us a little bit of his time. I just wanted to bring somebody in to give a little bit more of this perspective because I think sometimes when we talk about the Brooklyn Nets or you talk about your own team, you can very much get stuck inside of the fishbowl of what it feels like perceptually for you as a fan, for us covering the team, talking about the team 5 days a week. Conversely, when you are outside of it, you get a little bit, I think, sometimes a stronger sense. You're not going to have all the nitty-gritty details, but what you are going to have is someone that's not emotionally invested or has not been bogged down by the experience of several years of a process that has failed. That being the case, we're going to get out the door here. We'll be back in tonight following the crosstown matchup with the New York Knicks, post-game live, same as we've been doing all season long. And then tomorrow we have a great guest going to be lined up, for Friday. Make sure you check that out, both a on-the-court and off-the-court perspective on the team. And then Doug Norrie makes his revenge tour starting next week. We'll be very excited for that. In the meantime, YouTube, subscribe, like, love, and rate it. And of course, flip over on the podcast feed where we get those needs fulfilled, and hit us up in the comments on social media at Locked On Nets, at Adam Armbrecht. What do you want to see happen here? Who are the core players for this team, the young guys that you might want to carry over and be excited about, even if this thing is going in a direction we did not anticipate? Appreciate everybody as always, and we will be back in next time talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.